Okay, this is just a series of poems that I didn't really realize I was writing until a friend of mine mentioned something. A friend of mine who's a poet said, you have to figure out who your beloved is in your poetry. And I realized that often my beloved is my grandmother. So these poems are for her. First day at Indiana State Teachers College, 1926. You stood beside her until she finished one of 2 new dresses for your year at school. Short sleeves, taupe chiffon, a lace panel down the front. The relentless pedaling of the sewing machine propelling you farther away from home to this field lined with sycamore trees. The grass covered over with clover, the sun warm on your brown hair, the air too still to move a curl. You wear your mother's cameo, pinned fast to the dress she made. Your sister's pearls pale against your neck. Arms loose along your sides, as if you learned the drape of the lace, as if the slope of your curved hips mimicked its fluid folds. Poised between the rocking cadence of home and the edge of a grassy field, when your body, trimmed in delicate stitches, begins to stir. My grandmother was one of those remarkable women who sort of, could sew and knit and cook and make 12 pies in a day and help her husband drag a deer down the mountain. And anyway, this poem is called These Woods, and all these poems are based on stories that she told me. Dragging a deer down this mountain toward home, he thinks about these woods, how they appear as they must have 100 years ago. The same water runs under ice, the same rocks stand guard. Hard snow crunches underfoot. Bare, rough-skinned sticks interrupt a white that continues to cover the ground. He slides down the slope, hanging on to trees so close together he has to turn his shoulders as he descends. Again and again, his feet slip. His one hand grips a trunk until he catches the rhythm of the dance. With his other hand, he pulls the antlers of the buck. The wool of his hat, red and black, scratches his forehead. The deer bleeds red and black. All around him white and gray, and only the sound of the brook struggling to break through a mantle of ice. Down below he sees the iron rooster stuck atop the roof, pointing away from him, directing him westward. He lifts his head. The sky grows pink. He calls your name. It bounces back to him from the trees. You move between the table and the stove to put dinner on. He calls your name. You glance at the orange blossom clock above the kitchen sink and set each fork, each glass in its place. You stand at the door before you hear anything, and he is calling for you all the way down the bank until you meet him, coat unbuttoned, bareheaded, as trees give way to field, the brisk air rich with the sound. This last poem is just sort of still in process. Just wrote it recently. It's called Country Girl. 4 weeks you spent at the farm with your sister, who took sick after the birth of her child. The child sick to what would be polio, and you sent to do the work alongside the men. And women's work, too. tend the hens, gather the eggs, feed the men who milked for the dairy. Cows you could respect. You never liked the pigs, were afraid of them, their endless, indiscriminate hunger. But you fed them too, and made pie after pie. You could roll out a crust thin and light and supple as cloth. You'd drape the dough over each pie plate, fill the tin with northern spy, blackberries, mince, the edge pinched like a yard of rickrack. Never had you worked so hard in your life, you said, though your mother's place housed boarders. Your job to pull that oak table on its rollers all the way out and out until it could seat 20. That summer, the farm, outside in the dark, looked like the underside of your mother's quilts. The pasture, a broad expanse, little color, fences running like stitches, rough outline of fields. With your back to the barn, it was an ocean, the grasses fluid and dark. The water from the spring at home is what you miss, cool and sweet, coming from somewhere deep. And your mother, standing near the window at the sink, or in her rocker, head bent over her lap, pulling slowly on the needle as it dives in and out in tiny patterns on the quilt. Thanks.
Thanks, Jill, for getting us started with those beautiful poems. Thank you. Okay, our next reader is Mackenzie Evans.
Okay. This is a poem I wrote for Dr. Karn's creative writing class. It's called His Battered Hands. To him, it feels familiar. He strikes the keys and hears the clock. For them, he must deliver. Shoulders slumped, his eyes wither. Bleakest mornings bring no shock to him. It feels familiar. Buried hopes make coffee bitter. Will faraway opportunities unlock for them? He must deliver. More than just bread this winter. Frozen in frames, they try and talk to him. It feels familiar. To be the fatherly figure, lasting provider, steadfast rock. For them, he must deliver. At night, they hear the trucks shake and shiver. He's home, like hungry birds, they flock to him. It feels familiar. For them, he must deliver. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mackenzie. Wonderful. Sidoni Cipher is our next reader.
This is also a poem I wrote for Dr. Karn's class. It's called The Waiting Game. The wait grows long and fills you with despair, like acid rotting you from deep within, and feels like floating, or like nothing's there to hold you while you find if you got in. You wait as hours and hours turn to days, as shadows pass and dance across the walls, the telltale sign of sun and moon ablaze. And deep within, your stomach turns and falls each time the sound of news tickles your ear. But never yet has it been meant for you. You, like standing firm upon a crumbling tier, feel as though you might just fall right through the ground or stand in fire at Devil's Gate, for heaven may not be worth all this wait.
Okay, our next reader is Yalda Hijabi. Am I saying? Am I saying it right? Hijabi, okay.
This is a poem that I wrote for the literary festival class that I'm in right now with Dr. Sewell and Professor Drew. In school today, we learned the quadratic formula. The x is an unknown. The a, b, and c are constants. And a can never equal to 0, which is actually equal to nothingness in the world. We learned that the quadratic formula is giving. It gives us 2 solutions. Each solution a root of the equation. This we learned in school today. We set up our equation. The x is now not so much unknown. We don't know what equates to a, but nothingness is all we feel. We wish to keep a, b, and c the same, but we know the solutions will not result the way we want them to. The quadratic formula changes. Our math changes. This we learned in school today. We set up our equation again. This time, nothing is constant, and nothingness is meaningless. X is the insurgent, and the root of the solution depends on the existence of X. X tells us to convert, but converting constants is not easy. X tells us they don't care and grounds us to the rampant floor. X tells us that there is only one solution for the quadratic formula. But this is not what we had learned. When you take the squared root, where does the other half escape to? We fall into our nothingness and hope for him to save the day. When we fear the wrong answer, the insurgent scars a deeper fear. We sit silently, trying to solve this equation. I hear Gloria, Hawa, they're shouting Haliza, equate the A to what the insurgent says. I shiver for us, for we, for the girls of this country. I fear but sink into this arid destiny. When X is known, and when the 3 of us are no longer constants in this defeat, the solution becomes singular, and the quadratic formula becomes more complex. I hear you, Boko Haram. We hear you clear. A is equal to 1. 1 too many girls lost and burned away. And we change the constant because we must obey. In school today, I learned that I was never good at math anyway.
Okay, thank you, Yalda. Our next reader is Amanda Murphy.
Hi. I'm in Dr. Karn's creative writing class as well, and this poem is called Take My Word. This is how you should fall in love. Run to the end of the shore and scream until the underworld hears you. Let the whipping winds take your heart for security. It will not be dismantled, disfigured, destroyed. You see, sister, someone shot an arrow of tasteless torture into your precious heart, leaving a hole deeper than an alcoholic's whiskey shot glass. Love is no more than the black widow's venom that seeps into your stainless veins.
Our next reader is Nikki C. She didn't put her last name down.
Hi, I'm in Professor Karn's class as well, and mine is a fictional piece inspired by a photograph. It's called The Hill. The hill feels eerily the same, though climbing to the top proves more strenuous in my older age. Brittle grass brushes against my knees, as rough and disheveled as Luke's uncombed hair. My fingertips prick its coarse edges as I trudge through unmarked terrain, inhaling the itchy sweet scent of pollen and meadow flowers. It was Luke's smell, aside from when he masked it with cologne in an effort to please me. It cleanses my senses, shedding thoughts of frantic Manhattan, fancy people and parties,
the sort of lifestyle I dreamed of having but couldn't sustain. My skin, too weak to bear aggressive shoves of hasty commuters and blasting horns, has forgotten the forcefulness of humidity on a warm summer day. The only available refuge is a single oak tree and an equally misplaced quaint white house, which belonged to Mr. Wheeler. As a girl, I'd take this path each day in the thickening light of early evening to meet Luke. On the other end of the gentle slope, I see him sprawled across the back of his beige, run-down pickup truck, camouflaged in tall, dry grass. Arms and ankles crossed, he lays, his cap slipped slightly over his eyes. Strong and bronzed from working in the sun, his arms wrapped gently around me like a shawl. The picnic dinner he prepares is romantic, like my childish visions of Manhattan. Our life is simple, no divorce and no disappointment. It's filled with laughter and 3 children. This is what I imagine, but I will never know. On that last day, I never showed up for him. My father's words, "He's no good for you," rang in my ears and steered my judgment. I was going to leave, and he was going to stay. Now, as I sit atop the hill, staring out towards empty terrain, I turn to see Mr. Wheeler. His thick black hair has faded to gray, and his steps are slow and cautious proceeding up the hill. His eyes, still as bright as they were as he waved to me from the window each day, cut into me. Been a long time since I've seen you out here. I'm back for a while. Sure hard to leave, ain't it? It is. For a moment as he turns to go, I think to ask him about Luke. I remember the many times we stopped by his house for a late dinner before we went our separate ways, Luke to the ranch and me to my gated hideaway on the opposite end of town. He heard us speaking of leaving together while I knew I'd leave alone. Now I watch with an unwavering gaze as he walks away and the sun dips behind the hill.
Okay, and our next reader is Michaela Berendt.
Hi, I am going to read you 2 short poems by one of my favorite poets from when I was in high school. I wasn't really an angsty teenager, so I think that she kind of appealed to me. This is called A Song in the Front Yard. I've stayed in the front... Oh, her name's Gwendolyn Brooks, by the way. I probably should include that. I've stayed in the front yard all my life. I want to peek at the back, where it's rough and untended and hungry weed grows. A girl gets sick of a rose. I want to go in the backyard now, and maybe down the alley to where the charity children play. I want a good time today. They do some wonderful things. They have some wonderful fun. My mother sneers, but I say it's fine how they don't have to go in at 8:45. My mother. She tells me that Johnny May will grow up to be a bad woman, that George will be taken to jail soon or late on account of last winter he sold our back gate. But I say it's fine. Honest, I do, and I would like to be a bad woman too, and wear the brave stockings of night black lace, and strut down the streets with paint on my face. And then this one is called Truth. And if the sun comes, how shall we greet him? Shall we not dread him? Shall we not fear him? Shall we, after so lengthy a session with shade, though we have wept for him, though we have prayed all through the nights, years, what if we wake one shimmering morning to hear the fierce hammering of his firm knuckles hard on the door? Shall we not shudder? Shall we not flee into the shelter, the dear, thick shelter of the familiar propitious haze? Sweet is it to sleep in the coolness of snug unawareness. The dark hangs heavily over the eyes.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing Gwendolyn Brooks to our event. Our next reader is one of the students who entered the class of 2015 Creative Writing Awards, Jenny Lee.
So I wrote this first poem for Professor Drew's Intro to Creative Writing class last semester. It's called Newark. When we drive home, we pass through Newark, where the factory lamps burn against the oily night like lanterns hung on the branches of a winter tree. Sitting in the passenger seat of your car, drowsy from the warmth of the heater and my knitted scarf, I think those lights are so beautiful I could cry. Once I confessed this to you, and you laughed. Don't you see the dirty fumes coming from the factories? My cheeks grew hot, and I never mentioned the lights again. But the next time we drove home, we passed through Newark, and I was sleeping in the passenger seat when you woke me gently to say, "Look, your favorite lights." Okay, and the second poem I wrote for the Literary Festival class last year. It's called Dear. The grass has not been mown in a while. On this hot, humid morning, we sit around the table, eating tomatoes and peppers gathered in a bowl. We don't know the source of the sound that briefly woke us in the middle of the night, an abrupt shriek that ceased as quickly as it began. Sleep too heavy on our lids to investigate, we dismissed it as an unsettling dream. We only remember with breakfast conversation, and curiosity edges us toward the window. Spread outside, the crime scene. Verdant grass, thick with the promise of summer. Breeze rustling the sycamores. Then, the brown and crimson. A gaping cavity. Stiffened tendons, unnaturally bent limbs. Wide, empty stare, half covered by the spears of green. We want to look away, but we cannot. Look away from the creature, from what remains. Thank you.
Okay, and our next reader, I think, also is a senior who entered the senior class Creative Writing Awards contest, Mary Finnegan.
Hello, I'm Mary Finnegan. I wrote this story called Pizza Love, and it was based off an experience I had this senior year, and it was for my senior thesis for my English major. I was sitting in ethics class when I was first introduced to the theoretical benefits of casual relationships. Casual theory is different from casual reality. Theoretically, at least from the casual side of the debate, casual relationships are the ideal relationships. Everyone behaves as honest and responsible citizens, providing each other with a detailed catalog of their sexual histories. Who they had sex with, who they had anal with, who they got pregnant, who they planned to get pregnant, who they had got an STD from, who they gave an STD to. Essentially, a time-worn catalog of their every late-night adventure, from which there is an exact formula that you can calculate your probability of getting AIDS from them. It's always very high. He was standing outside of Kelly's, Villanova's only bar that doesn't resemble a dilapidated closet. He was smoking, always a wonderful barometer for future character, and alone. I knew his name was Eric. I knew he knew Spanish, or pretended to know a little Spanish, because I had met him 4 years ago in the lounge, and he had tried to help me with my conjugations. I thought he was cute at the time, and had never seen him again. Well, no time like the present. It'd been far too long since I'd had myself a good cuddle. And hey, he'd even gotten better with a little age. "Hey there, mister," I said, putting my best seductive tone on. I think it was the strange address that arrested his attention, rather than any success at the seductional tone. "Hey," he said, putting out the cig. Thank God, imagine the smell on his breath. "Do I know you?" Apparently, I had been more love-struck than him. He didn't remember our encounter. "Well, now you do," I said. And that was that. Theoretically, both partners involved are respectfully sober. Their brains are running on full substance-free capacity, so that when one of them says, "Hey, would you be okay with having sexual intercourse?" the other one says, "Yes, please. I fully consent to having sexual intercourse, provided you solemnly swear that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, about your history of STDs. I asked Eric if he had a condom, and he said, "We already talked about this. Don't you remember?" I missed the first time. That Long Island did the memory in a notch or two, and only a post-coital Dorito munching session could revive it. "Well," I said, "guess we'd really better go for round 2 then. It'll be brand new, just like the first time." If Christians actually wanted us to save ourselves from marriage, they would never have lifted prohibition. Stop drinking, and 99.99% of college students' sex lives would come to an immediate halt. I keep putting out little slogans: saving myself for Grey Goose, say no to Smirnoff, and I lost my sobriety to Natty Light, think before you drink, but the fundamentalists haven't seemed too keen on them yet. Theoretically, both partners involved are professionally detached in demeanor, having thoroughly discussed the rules of the arrangement and agreed not to have any feelings, feeling-induced chemicals, inclinations towards love, romantic notions, or urges to say any of the following phrases: "I love you," "I like you," "You're kind of cool," "This was fun," "I had a good time." The deal is sex for sex, provided, of course, they both orgasm, which, in theory, they always do. But when a mishap does happen, the disclaimer generously allows for slight feelings of animosity, should the wronged party feel the need for a little venting. There is this word for a certain type of behavior that no woman wants to hear herself described as: clingy. I take all measures to avoid this adjective, to avoid being typecast as the archetype of woman who tries to guilt him into ending his glorious stint as a bachelor, who tries to anchor him to her like a leech, who tries to smother his fun-loving, carefree, womanizing side in favor of commitment. The next morning, I always tell myself, "Well, this is it, baby. You'll never see or hear from him again, and that is all right. He's going to disappear, fall off a cliff, move to Arizona, get killed by the mob, and that is all right. In fact, maybe even, although this is highly unlikely, highly improbable, maybe even he will still be walking around campus, but he will just not want to hear or speak to you ever again, and that is all right. Make your goodbyes, I tell myself, or non-goodbyes. Goodbye is a little too certain, don't you think? Yeah, I'll go with later. Leave it more ambiguous, more open to interpretation. So when I took Eric's phone number, I knew it was just a formality, a nice gesture to let me off easy, make me think that this wasn't really the end. Well, I thought, at least he's open to playing the part. It's always nice to pretend. But then he stopped me at the door before our non-goodbyes. "Hey," he said, hitting me with that fake Spanish smolder. He's German, it turns out. "We should see each other again. I had a really good time." "Sure," I say, wondering if I should kiss him, or if that seemed too eager, if a hug was more appropriate, or maybe he was more of a fist bump type guy. Or maybe I should stop standing here in this doorway, staring mutely into his fake Spanish smolder. "Goodbye," he said, kissing me. "I'll text you." My friend, a beautiful girl whose clean-eating, treadmill-worn body has never failed to attract men, tells me about the rules, about how you know if they really like you or not. Rule number 1. The man will text you first. Always let the man text you first, or it will seem desperate, or unwomanly, or clingy. She is very adamant about this rule, particularly since I have a past history of not following it. She insists quite seriously that playing the part of the woman is the key ingredient to gaining respect and commitment from within a hookup context. Let him be the man, she says. Let him feel in charge. It will make him feel masculine, powerful, and validated. It will make him insatiable, ready to hunt down your evolutionary scent to the ends of the earth, if only to bask in the thrill of the chase that all men crave, that all men need. In fact, it's better never to let him find you, or his desire will be quenched, and he will toss you away just like pizza. I texted Eric. I don't know what happened to my vagina, but I was suddenly struck by a desire to be unwomanly. Perhaps it was the pizza. It hadn't been 24 hours yet, but I was suddenly inspired to take action, to take pursuit, to take chase. Strange how that can happen. I have put the clock away. I prefer not to think about the average time lapse between texts. Less than 10, and oh, he wants it, according to my friend. A beautiful girl whose clean-eating, treadmill-worn body has never failed to attract men, or, for that matter, to decipher the hidden meaning of texting intervals. 15, oh, he's playing hard to get. Doesn't want to appear too eager. 30, and this might be a little of a reach for you, don't you think? This man really holds himself in high regard. An hour, and oh no, he's never responding. He thinks you're ugly and only wants to fuck. 8.5 minutes, he responds. Oh, he wants it.
Okay, thanks, Mary. So our next reader is Alan Drew.
I have to follow that. Thanks, Mary. Well, hi. I'm going to read just a section from a novel called Santa Ana, my novel, that's going to be published next year about this time at Random House. I'm trying to figure out how much you need to know before I read this, but this is late in the book, and it's from the point of view of one of the main characters in the story. Her name's Natasha Bentoncourt, and she's a medical examiner. So there's been a series of murders that have been going on. Yes, there's a serial killer in this book. I always feel strange when I say that, but there is one. Been a series of murders, and she's been performing much of the investigations to determine how they've been killed, autopsies and various things. She's a little worn out. Simultaneously, there's another investigation that's headed up by her love interest, and his name is Benjamin Ward. And there's a 17-year-old boy, Mexican boy, that's turned up in a strawberry field. And through that investigation, she's sort of discovered the secret of his that really troubles and disturbs her. And sort of through finding that out and dealing with that, she sort of starts to have to confront her past. And previous in the book, we found out that she was sexually assaulted in college, and she knows where he lives now. So I think that makes sense. All right. Natasha believed in science. She believed in finding the truth. She believed, as her father, the immunologist, used to tell her, to expect more of herself than she did from others. Good advice if you expected to spend your life acting superior, as her father had. He'd become so disappointed with people, he packed everything up, including her mother, and moved to Montana to get away from them. Natasha had been 18 at the time, a freshman in college, and she'd felt their escape as an abandonment, as though she too was a disappointment to him. She wasn't prepared to do that, though. She wasn't prepared to give up on people, even when she couldn't expect much out of them. It was Saturday morning, the sky so windblown that when she rode the interchange from the Santa Ana freeway onto the 22, she could see the whole basin from the San Gabriels to the Pacific. The air was so bright with sun she had to squint, even through her sunglasses. She'd been up most of the night in her kitchen, thinking about Ben and Tucker, thinking about the dead child, Lucero. She was angry with them, angry with all of them, even the dead boy, but she was most angry with Ben. Women expected to live in a world where they could be overpowered. You didn't walk down a dark street alone late at night. You didn't leave the door to your apartment unlocked. You didn't agree to meet someone at their place on a first date. Just being alone with a man in an elevator was enough to make you sweat. But Ben was a cop. Ben was over 6 feet tall and 200 pounds. Ben's job was to protect people. Her, if she should be attacked, his daughter Emma, and the boys. And he had the power to do so physically and by the authority of the law. How could he not use it? But in the early morning, halfway into a doers, her conversations with Ben turning circles in her head, she realized she was angry at herself, too. You don't climb into a stranger's car drunk. And she heard her father's admonition again. She couldn't expect more from Ben than she did from herself. She knew the address, had known it for nearly 6 years, 19787 DeSoto Avenue. And when she overpassed it onto the 405, the bay and the oil derricks glimmering in the sun, she thought briefly about driving past the exit, up into LA, up through the Santa Monica Mountains and into Ventura, and then up the coast highway where the mountains fell into the Pacific. She got off at Cherry Avenue, though, and drove through the bad neighborhoods with the rusted chain link fences and the barking dogs behind them, and the men sitting on the steps of slanting houses drinking 40 ounces out of paper bags, past Signal Hill and the oil derricks drilling down in the soil, past East Anaheim Avenue where the houses were suddenly gabled, the green grass watered. She turned on DeSoto Avenue and slowly idled up the street. When she passed the address, a man was outside, pushing a mower in neat lines toward the front porch. She passed the house, a refurbished bungalow, nicely painted, a minivan in the driveway, and drove around the block and passed the house again before parking at the end of the street. She sat in the car and watched him. He was thinner than she remembered, his white legs sticking out from Bermuda shorts, his thin hair flying away in the wind. The whole basin, some 12 million people, were terrified of the serial killer. But the serial didn't frighten her. She knew about death. She lived with it every day. When you were dead, you were simply gone. What frightened her was what someone could do to your life. What frightened her was here, pushing a craftsman back and forth on his green lawn. He had always been here, taking his dinner in this house, laying his head down at night to sleep, kissing his wife and daughters goodbye before rushing off to a meeting. Why had he frightened her so? She knew what he was, blood and bone, viscera and sinew. He was the thing rotting by Thursday if killed on Monday. She stepped out of the car when he shut off the mower. When she came up the street, he was sitting on his porch sweating, gulping down a glass of lemonade that surely his wife had made for him. "Good morning," he said kindly as she made it to the front of his house. "Hot one today." "Nice house," she said. He glanced back at it as though he'd forgotten what it looked like. "It needs a lot of work," he said, "but it's 70 years old. It's got character." "A lot of history," she said. "That's hard to find around here." "Yeah, knock it down and build it anew." Through the open gate to the backyard, she saw 2 girls in yellow bathing suits jumping in the sprinkler. "Are you Robbie Sawyer?" she said. His face changed, the color leaching from the cheeks. "Robert," he said. "Do you remember you took a girl for a ride up to Signal Hill," she said, "1974, the submarine races?" He stared at her and sidestepped to the backyard gate, pulling it closed until it clicked in the lock. He picked up a face towel from the porch and wiped his forehead as he came up to her. She stepped back onto the curb as he neared. He noticed and stopped, keeping a swath of green grass between them. "That was a long time ago," he said. 12 years and 3 months. He nodded, his eyes shifting nervously in his head. "I had a drinking problem for a long time," he said. I hurt a lot of people." "You raped me," she said, the words sounding sharp and terrible in the hot air between them. Water came into his eyes, something she hadn't prepared herself for. "I'm sorry," he said. I used to black out. I wasn't in control of myself." "Daddy, Daddy," one of the girls yelled from behind the closed gate. "Let us out." "There are statutes of limitations," he said in full panic now. "Daddy, open the gate." "Do you remember me?" she said. He shook his head, his eyes pleading. No, I don't." Thanks.
All right, thanks. That was fantastic. Fantastic. Our next reader is Sophia Prince. Sophia, where did you go?
Hello.
Wow.
This is a memory I have. It's called Green Suede Shoes. I have a memory, though it is quite vague. It is a memory of my shoes. I'm looking down over my nose, down a purple corduroy skirt, over my knees in flowery knit tights, to a pair of green suede shoes, with an ivy detail carved on the side. Green shoes that were a gift from my mother. She insisted I be ladylike. Lacy socks and big bright bows and my few golden hairs. I sit high in my booster seat in the back seat of our gray leather rental car. My mom sits in the driver's seat ahead of me to the left, just the two of us. Her petite porcelain hands hang on the steering wheel with her head bowed, shaking, the air conditioning blasting at her from the dash. Her coarse auburn hair, slightly curled at the bottom, bounces at her head, continues to shake. She's laughing, not giggling, but sucking all the air in that she can, like the laughs are pushing their way out of her. She's laughing, and so I'm giggling, as big as my little lungs can manage. We're sitting on the side of a 2-lane road, somewhere green and sticky. Oh, honey, we're so lost, she says over and over again, like a mantra, a phrase she's quite familiar with. She was one of those people that kept her guardian angel busy. I watch my mom pick up the billing map on the passenger seat, a picture of a long green shape surrounded by blue, and run her finger along the little purple lines like Christian and I do with the cards on the map rug in the playroom. Oh, Jesus help us, she manages through the snickers, hoping that he'll hear us from this empty road. If only she knew directions as well as she knew little girls' clothes.
Okay, our next reader is Mary Anna Ebert.
This is a poem I wrote for my Creativity on the Page learning community for Dr. Staples. It's called Expectations. Love struck my fragile mind, promised milk and honey, no more pain or struggle. I was convinced this man would carry me to the promised land. Forever, such a simple word, sat idly upon my lips, a stealthy, worn-out word, the meaning lost in translation. Candy-coated chicory was fed to my foolish mind, and I swallowed it whole. He sang me sweet tunes, his touch assuaged all doubt, troubling my tentative conscience. Truth and lies became synonymous to my naive heart. I just needed to know it was possible for one man to have faith in me. The desire to be loved tunneled my vision. Oblivious to the thousands of pinpricks I received from the alluring roses, I made this vision into my home, settled in for months on end. Never once did I ponder life beyond the safe haven I had grown accustomed to. Until the paint began to peel, revealing the hideous mural beneath, of jagged twists and dashes, insidious stains of deep reds and sinister blacks. My heart plunged, and my fingers trembled. I fought my way to the doors, but I was locked inside. Whether it was my own mind playing tricks, or you were involved in the treacherous scheme, I could not linger to hear the answer. Fear, distrust, and lack of certainty ruled the recesses of my perception. I tried to expunge the corrosive thoughts. I tried to let your voice mute the contemplations. I tried to persuade myself it was just a graphic nightmare. These apprehensive thoughts shredded my conscience, one sliver at a time. Yet, instead of idling in anticipation, awaiting the final tear, longing for you to perceive my declination, I collected the tattered remains, head held high and certain, and strode out into the fresh air.
Okay, thanks, Mariana. So the next reader is Stephanie. I can't. Okay, I can read your writing. All right, welcome.
Hi, I'm also in Dr. Karn's creative writing class. My poem's called Better Lover. Behold, the golden grail, filled with hearts oh so frail, soft as sugar-filled gummies, uncolored as newspaper trimmings. Aphrodite's hand, graceful limb, palest swan, submerges into the sea of hollow hearts, like the ravenous claw of a crane machine. An eel's electric caress, a living defibrillator. The enveloped hearts slowly ignite, like lamplights. Crimson fireflies blaze her skin, warm passion like cherry syrup. As she lifts her hand, clumsy hearts flow out between skeletal fingers. Their light not fully grown, love like an underdeveloped rose, nothing but a crush. The goddess gulps down the lover's hearts, dancing in her belly, mating butterflies, forever in the Ferris wheel of love and heartbreak. Never getting off the ride, constantly moving, up, down, up, down. The machine never tires. But oh, the pity, the neglected hearts buried under 1,000 siblings, Grail's bottom, forgotten by their holy master, too many to keep count. No limbs to climb with, no voice to scream with. Ants devour them, hollowing the abandoned hearts inside out. I await them all as I sit on my throne, deep, deep down, underneath earth's dry skin, accepting all, dying to meet me. Indiscriminate love, all are chosen for death's unquenching appetite. I smile sweetly, all the while cupids dance around the rims and sing.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. So our next reader is Emily Powers.
So I I wrote this for Professor Drew's short story class, and it's 16 pages long, so I'm gonna skip around. But basically, this girl, her mother's died, so she visits her grandmother, and she learns that her father has been involved in kind of this rape and murder of a young black girl. She's kind of, and then her, she's dealing, why is she feeling guilty? So it's called Inheritance. She woke up dry-eyed with the sun on her face and the dusty grit of the South on her tongue. She ran to the sink, angled her head under the rusty faucet, and let the icy water pour forth, into her mouth, down her face, on her head, like the tears she hadn't shed, like a twisted baptism, anointing her for what? For what? Clementine couldn't see her reflection in the frosted window. It had snowed, finally. No matter how much she gurgled, it always returned. The South, that is. She had been reading Faulkner novels incessantly. She only bought used copies, 5 battered editions of Absalom, Absalom, 3 beat-up Light and Augusts, a hefty 8 dog-eared copies of The Sound and the Fury. If she held the book to her chest tightly enough, she could almost feel the ghosts, the lives of the previous owners, first awakening and then circling somewhere around her head. It was comforting, she thought, to read with company. She could only guess at the whispers they left, spinning, dazed, in the air, and then smearing on the ceiling like bloody handprints. One day, Clementine promised, she would know what they knew. She could see her breath in the dark, spooling out of her body like a phantom. Tomorrow she would visit Nana. If anyone had ghosts circling about overhead, it was surely that woman. She had bypassed them all. She was a monument. Some part of Clementine believed that she would live forever, like a mothball-smelling god among fresh-faced mortals. She could almost feel Nana's piercing stare through the walls, examining her as she lay in her childhood bed, a grown woman in princess sheets, too big for this world. Funny how she still felt small. Clementine had become accustomed, in the moments, late at night or just upon waking, to staring at the back covers where Faulkner's headshot rested,
His face was adorned with either shadows or the quiet pink of the rising sun, head turned just so, bristling mustache, eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name despite much deliberation. She spread the books around her room, surrounding and encircling her, one on her dresser next to her mother's high school graduation picture, one by the desk lamp, one on the bare desk, one by her old stuffed elephant, each with a back cover facing her bed. A dozen Faulkners solemnly staring, gaze averted, always looking to the side, avoiding her questions, deaf to the murmured whispers. If only she could figure out the eyes. She swore he looked just like the man her father would have been at that age. The day of her mother's funeral, she lay in her childhood bed, body like stone. She wore the tight black dress her mother had bought her 2 years ago as a Christmas present, with a note attached that read, "Call me, let's catch up." The dress now faced a different kind of reunion. Out of the corner of her eye, she swore she saw one of the Faulkners, perched on her nightstand, flick its gaze to her face. She turned and sat up, but the black and white picture refused to meet her stare. A faint buzzing could be heard. Just then, her neck prickled, and movement danced in her periphery, by the desk, which was no longer bare. A faded yellow newspaper bearing a date from a decade ago was spread out, its contents everywhere, a ripped gut, innards left scattered on the table. She jumped to her feet, but there he was, gaze averted, classic Faulkner. All around the room, rapid movements flashed, like their eyes were lasers, and she was the cat, always too slow, always a beat behind. The buzzing was louder now, causing the room to vibrate. She put her hand to the wall. Her teeth chattered mechanically. "Come out," she called. "Show yourself, come out." Her voice caught. She couldn't breathe. Choking, she reached into her mouth, saliva bubbling, cheeks wet with tears, grabbing that rough fabric, forcing the cotton out of her throat. She sighed in relief, which soon turned to panic as she felt the scratchiness in her throat again. As she sunk to her knees, her stomach bucked, and she vomited out the plush whiteness again and again. With each new piece, she threw it in the corner of the room. She lost track of time. She closed her eyes, and there she sat, black dress askew, windows darkened, in the middle of her bedroom, with a monstrous mound of purebred, manufactured hate. Whispers rang out, like a pitter-patter of feet, running up to her ears and scurrying away, taunting her. "Who is it?" she said, hoarse. She could feel the pile buzzing. The vibrations caused a few pieces of cotton to roll down, revealing several inches of a dark braid in its depths. "Alicia?" The buzzes converged into a deep, hearty wail. Then, in Alicia's voice, now a southern drawl, "The past isn't dead. It isn't even past." She swiveled suddenly and caught the Faulkners with their mouths open. "Look at me," she screeched. The Faulkners refused to respond, mouths still open in a silent howl. "Look at me," she repeated, words scraping like sandpaper in her throat. The cotton's buzzes screeched to silence as a black hand shredded through the snowy mass. Alicia shot down and grabbed her, bleeding her bright black blood onto the cotton and Clementine's white hands. She shook Clementine's shoulders and screamed, pointing back at the pile which had morphed into a nest of hooded men, eyes like hot coals. She blinked and she saw their bright torches and their vibrant hatred, a thrilling red, so permeable, so tangible, she found her fingers reaching out and tearing, wresting the bloodied anger out of the cotton with a pop. But the cotton, the rage, twisted into her. It became her. She writhed on the floor, kicking the desk. She knew she was dead. She knew it, and Faulkner knew it. Why couldn't she rest? Why couldn't she get out of the house? Why wasn't her father here instead? Why her? Why her?
Okay, I think Emily's also one of the seniors who entered the creative writing contest. Maria McGeary is our next reader.
This is an assignment I wrote for Professor Drew's class. It's another memory. It's called The Sunflower Dress. I remember the dress I wore that night because I hated it. My older sister was taller and quicker, and she always snatched the Cinderella dress from the dress-up bin before me, which meant I was always stuck with the ugly green one. My mother thought I was being silly. "It matches your eyes," she said as she zipped it up, tying the bow too loosely. I didn't see how this made it a pretty dress, and I told her so. She just smiled at me in the big mirror that hung on the wall in my parents' bedroom. It was the only mirror in the house where you could see your entire outfit if you found the exact spot between the dresser and the hamper, stood on tiptoes, and leaned a few inches to the left. I did this, struggling to get the right angle, but before I could find another reason to hate the dress, my mother sat down at the bureau and opened the pearl box. The box was green, dark green like a Christmas tree with a shiny gold border. Inside were my mother's pearls, a gift from my father. She only wore them on special occasions, like nights when the babysitter came and my parents came home past my bedtime. This was one of those nights. We liked to play dress up while she got ready. I don't know why my sisters liked it, but I know I did because I could pretend that I was going to. I wanted to wear the black ink on my eyelashes and paint my lips dark red, but as I watched her, I knew those things wouldn't make me beautiful like her. I knew that it wasn't the ugly dress that made me different, because my mother's dress was ugly too that night. It was long and covered in sunflowers. They were her favorite flower, but I remember thinking that somehow it was less ugly on her, or maybe she was beautiful in spite of it, or maybe she made it beautiful. I don't remember which pajamas I wore when I finally stepped out of the ugly green dress, or whether the babysitter made us brush our teeth before we slid under the covers, and I don't remember what woke me up hours later. My sister and I shared a room then, and we had a rule. If one of us was lucky enough to be awake past our bedtime, she had to wake the other up as well. I remember thinking that she would never know if I didn't wake her, that I could keep this golden opportunity all to myself. But it was darker now than when I had closed my eyes, and darkness is only half as scary with someone else's hand to squeeze. She tried to push my hands away when I shook her shoulders. "Stop it," I hissed, batting her hands away. She stopped for a moment and looked around, realizing that I was only holding to our agreement, and we were instantly reconciled by our shared complicity. I remember that goosebumps rose in my arms when the soft blankets slid off and the air kissed my skin. The hallway was pitch black except for the beam of the nightlight in the bathroom. The hardwood floor was cold between our toes as we slipped out of the bed and crept silently to the stairs, partners in crime, shushing each other and shooting dirty looks every time the floor creaked. I had no concept of the time, no idea that our babysitter had already gone home. The stairs were carpeted, and my feet were much warmer, nestled in the soft fibers. We inched forward, my sister and I, down one stair, then another, until finally on the third we were low enough to peek through the banister to see if the house looked different when we were supposed to be asleep. I don't remember what I expected to be different, what I was hoping we might see, but I remember that music was playing and I recognized the song, "Can't Take My Eyes Off of You" by Frankie Valli, my father's favorite. My mother's shoes were on the floor next to the leg of the kitchen table. All the lights were off, except for the one over the sink. It was just enough light to see my parents in the center of the kitchen floor, dancing. I remember the way my mother's dress whirled around her knees as she spun, the way my father's hand held her waist, his tie loosened around his neck. Their other hands were clasped together, and my father's wedding band lay beside my mother's diamond, and both of them sparkled as they spun and dipped and laughed. He kissed her, and my sister made a tiny noise of disgust, burying her face in my shoulder, but I kept watching. Minutes later, she squeezed my arm, begging me to go back to our room. She didn't want to get in trouble, but I shook my head, refused to follow her. I don't know how, but I knew there was no way we would get in trouble that night. So I sat there on the landing, listening to the music change, feeling the soft carpet beneath my bare feet, and watched my parents dance in the light of a single lamp above the kitchen sink. My sister was asleep when I finally crawled back under the covers. Lying in bed with my eyes pressed shut, I realized that I hadn't noticed the pearls as I watched them dance, or thought about the ugly sunflower dress, or wondered whether her lipstick was still as red as it was when she kissed us goodnight. And I wondered if my father ever forgot to notice those things too, when he looked at my mother.
Okay, fantastic. Kathy Staples is our next reader, and Kathy teaches creative writing for us in English.
I am going to start off with, I'm going to read two pieces that are sort of related by sense of place. We go to Wellfleet on Cape Cod in the summer, and both of these are sort of from the same stretch. You probably all know Thoreau, but have you ever heard of Henry Beston? He is another naturalist, and he was in World War I and very much traumatized by the deaths that he witnessed. And so he built a house on Nauset Beach to try and get through it. And this is called Henry Beston at the Outermost House. After the rut of war, you sunk your faith in fairy tales. writing one after another, but the solace was makeshift. So with good New England wood, you built a house in sand on Nauset Beach, a place to come summer. 2 rooms, 10 windows, a well pipe to water under the dunes, chimney to warm the rooms, oil lamps, candles, and a maw of driftwood. A simple lookout on sea and marsh. With every intention of staying a fortnight, you lasted a year. The roar of the sea held you, rhythm of the great waves breaking in threes. Daily the ebb tide delivered its due, seagrass and rockweed, bleached scald of seals, then half an oar, a horseshoe crab gutted with sand. Bare-handed you lifted him by the spire of his tail, rinsing him in waves, until the 100 whip-like cilia were motion again. Each night the beam of Nauset light swept across your wall. On the morning my grandfather walks the beach, you balance mid-rung on the Coast Guard's borrowed ladder, hammering down shingles, readying for winter. You've thrown your lot in with the solitary hawk who carries you down the beach. Who harries you down the beach. Circus Hudsonius, skimming the blue-black, infinitely slow rollers. Probably a nest far side of the marsh. On that day, she nearly sends you, toppling from the roof with the close call of battering wings. Over beers in the lantern, you'll recall the assault of her attentions as nearly amorous. Quip about Leda and the swan, laughing with the guardsman on night watch. But just now you're waist flush to the roof, double hammering, bare-chested, lean, behind you marsh, mudflat, and rank animal reek, a phalanx of green fiddlers gone sideways into the reeds. When I was writing that piece, the editor of the Southern Review asked me to say where exactly the house was built on Nauset Beach. And I found myself looking at Wellfleet maps and seeing that the Nauset Spit was pretty close to a lot of the places where there are a lot of shipwrecks on Cape Cod. And I found myself reading about shipwrecks and writing this next poem. It's called The Wreck of the Jason. And one thing you might not know is jute. Jute is a bale of sort of roughly hewn cloth. And when the Jason wrecked, there was only one survivor. And so this is another poem like the first of a survivor. The only other thing I need to mention is, for those of you who are Games of Thrones people, do you remember what Ygritte says about Jon Snow? She says, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." And I poached a little bit from that line, "You know nothing, Jon Snow," in my first line. And then there's an epilogue that's from the Coast Guard's log that begins this. This is called The Wreck of the Jason. It's little you know or thought you knew. Excuse me, I missed the the epilogue. The Wreck of the Jason. They sensed trouble, and they notified stations all along the backside. Soon the North Patrol of Nauset saw her, then Cahoon's Hollow, and then Pamet River. It's little you know or thought you knew, there in the sand stumbling, hardly upright, the sea still in you, her rack and swell, her heady rock and shift, water and air mixed. The slap of the long wave reverberates. You're on all fours crawling uphill, the audible crack as the keel split, and the heart astonished by its permeable borders, the livingness beyond air. The others gone under. They hadn't your luck. Was it the bale of jute? or the sleek bob of a seal's head that righted your course. Skin to skin, some supernal rhythm held you. The steep bank in glimpses, flattened grass above the headland, before you washed up on the shingle, nearly frozen, bleary with sleet. A week later, blanketed by the hearth in a cottage above Williams Pond, you'll recollect the terrible slatting of sails against the spars. The mind's din interrupted by the arrival of a neighbor's horse, the homely clatter of his hooves, then harness, as you step out into the sunlit yard and he lowers his head to your chest, the blow of his breath settling yours. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. The crowds are thinning. But we had lots of great readers, so that's nice. Our next reader is John Sott, and he is also a senior, and he was one of the people who participated in the creative writing contest.
Okay, so this one's called The Return to Tug Hill. The deer must have kept the grass short, trimmed to the edges of the clapboard porch. There's no creak, no protest of dried pine as my father slips open the door. It's like a stone turned over, 2 years of rot, uncovered in search for worms. To clear the stale taste from the air, he steps with practiced habit and grasps the gnawed handle of the broom set beneath the skylight. In one deft motion, my father lifts the pull up, pulling my eyes over a table of jumbled bottles and the cobweb cast iron hung from the wall, until the tip of the handle locks into place, the notch in the woodblock nailed to the sill's bottom edge, which keeps the window shut. My father pushes slightly, and the block turns, just as my grandfather's hand first turned the block on the nail, letting out the smell of fresh-cut resin stuck on his hands, which he washed in the cold steel sink of St. Elizabeth's before the exam, when he put the flat of the stethoscope on Mr. Pound's back and said, "Breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out." The air must have come rushing in, flooding through years of smoke-filled walls and half-spoken words born in such a lonely cage. Though now the block just turns and the window comes free, and Dad sets the broom back into its place. Thanks.
Okay, we've got two more readers. Lucia Herman.
Hello. No introductions, okay? This is not a poem. Blue and green and their associated follies because I only exist between extremes. See, blue is the color of winter's beauty, efficiency, steely, and somewhat unfeeling, nightclubs, chemistry, digital, precision, the math that makes structure stand. Blue is waiting to speak. More scientifical? Oops, I guess I mean scientific. Frosty, whitewashed dreams, powdered perfection, ice cracking, crunching footsteps beneath, the salt I see and fear of touching. The northeast embrace. Small girlish hips, taste of metallic. The letter E and ecstasy, something wet, more of the present, impressions that are hard to forget, following recipes, crystallized proteins and DNA delicacies. It's people from the city. New York, that is. Less bass, more skinny white dude jams out to relevant pop. It's restaurants and white wine, journalism and security, thinking about a 401k, and soft kisses in places I once thought stagnant. Eyes that only believe what they see. Green. Green is the color of summer's haze. Warm, dry days and post-workout sweat drip, outside bars and Paris cafes. Green is listening, rapping, and letting rhymes come easy. Biology, more like the things we understand theoretically, analog, but ticking moments I can never bring myself to notice. It's bursts of creative inspirations, trees, feed, and sunflower seeds. It's making up my own recipe, the letter F, failure, no. More like feels like family first, and also Francaise. It's cellular, like I can imagine mRNA being modified, but I'll never see it passing in the cytosol. It's less rigid, more about the process. It's jazz and soulful melodies, bare feet through the forest, palm trees and heart race. Feels more like collective history. Stronger? Maybe. Definitely a sense of athleticism, Latin men, double Ds, ordering in and craft beer. It's giving in to undefined passions like dancing and never, ever, ever, ever thinking about paying taxes. Questions, not answers. And eyes that never define what I believe. But what about where the two meet? Blue and green, land and sea, an ocean of possibility. It's sailboats and sunny days, lonely walks where I learn a lot, cemeteries where I think of love, beaches that only sometimes feel like home. It's brains touching without ever speaking, bodies only made for feeling, islands of serenity and clearly some sort of LSD, wondering if anyone else has ever felt this way and knowing I'll have to try and explain. This is not a poem. It's random incoherent pieces of me pieced together peacefully, and so, dear friends, gather in, collect your golden orbs of memories. See, science, cold hard science, will never explain the spectrum of how we think. Yeah.
Okay, our final reader is Julianne Wu.
Hello. I'm a part-time student from Bryn Mawr to Villanova, and I wrote this piece for Dr. Karn's class for creative writing. It's called Food for the Dead Poet. Wrapped with care in a pair of bamboo leaves and a bit of twine, 粽子 remind me of a culture that should be familiar to me. Sinking my teeth into the sticky rice, relishing the taste, the smell of bamboo in the rain, my mind wanders to the watercolor ink paintings I've often seen in that section in the museum titled Asian Art. A scroll of pressed hydrangeas hangs from the kitchen wall, and I stare at its soft, flowing brush strokes. It's like looking into a river, spotting shapes and patterns from the sunlight that frolics and skips across a moving mirror. In our yard, we have hydrangeas. We don't have the tall slopes of the Yellow Mountains or the windswept rooftops of Suzhou lining the town's water canal. I wonder what they look like in the real world today, in person. But the mouthful between my teeth reminds me of my hunger and the need to sate that wonderful, delicious craving for more 粽子. Every year, Baba makes 粽子by the dozen, gently furling the case of dried foliage to hold in the nest of his hand like an ice cream cone. Using a flat paddle, he packs it full with rice, sometimes mixed with small blocks of pork, sometimes green or red beans, or nothing at all. He has to be gentle and mindful, though. Too much, and the 粽子 will leak at the seams when boiled. Too little, and it will become soggy, losing its texture and falling away into an unidentifiable mass of mush that is supposed to be 粽子, his 粽子. We eat 粽子in the summer, always around the same time. My family calls it 粽子节. When I hear that word, my mind hones in on the part that matters, of course. 粽子, those delicious rice ball things. In broken Mandarin, I strain to reply in conversation with Baba as he prepares the 粽子. I give up and defer to English while he switches back and forth between the two, favoring his mother tongue. He prefers to boil the 粽子, he says, as opposed to steaming them, which I find odd. Steaming food is usually quicker. I want to eat the 粽子soon, preferably now. He takes his sweet time, grinning wide as I bounce in my seat, my hands tucked under my thighs. After all these years, I've never grown out of the habit. And though I'm almost 20, I can still see the gleam in his eyes whisper, 孩子, child, my daughter. As he works, Baba tells me the story behind 粽子, one that he's certain I've never heard before. They're a traditional Chinese food made for a festival held in the summer called 端午节 in Mandarin,
and in honor of a poet who lived during the Warring States era. His name was Qu Yuan. I struggle with the pronunciation. He was a patriot, and when his home nation fell to the rule of another, he cast himself into a river and drowned. Baba also says that zongzi came about from a legend that the local townsfolk threw packets of rice wrapped in leaves into the river where Qu Yuan laid to keep the fish from eating his body. Back then, I imagine, rice is precious. During times of war, people can't afford to throw away provisions on a consistent basis, especially not for someone who's already dead. So, maybe, they turned to boiling the packets of rice, which they could then eat like the fish in the river, to preserve Qu Yuan at rest. It's fitting. A bit morbid, but appropriate, I think to myself. The words, "I see," slip past my lips, and for a moment I do see. I see a man with a balding head and a dark triangular beard from 1600 years ago in a hanfu robe, one that is as cold and pale as death, lying face first beneath the surface of moving glass. I look at Baba, trying to picture him in a hanfu, maybe blue with a black hemline and white sash. Rolling up his long, wide sleeves, he shows me how to furl the bamboo leaves and offers me a paddle to scoop from the mixture of rice and pork blocks and fill the cone in my hand. I can now make my own zongzi, so that one day, many years from now, I can teach my children how to make them. The story of Qu Yuan, my father's story, and Haizi. Thank you.
Okay, so for those of you who are left, we want to announce the people who won the contest. So Alan's going to come up here and help me. Okay, I'll go first. So the class poet contest was judged by Harriet Milan Levin, and she teaches at Drexel University. She's the author of several books of poetry, and she is going to come on the day of the English Department Awards ceremony and comment on the winner. So I'll start with the runners up. We have two runners up. Jenny Lee. Is Jenny still here? All right, yay, Jenny. And Mike Sorensen, who is still here. And the winner was John Zott, who read that wonderful poem about his father. And so congratulations, John.
All right, so for the fiction, it was judged by Robert Rosenberg. He's a novelist. He teaches at Bucknell University, and he said it was a very difficult decision. But honorable mention is Pizza Love by Mary Finnegan, which I'm sure you remember. And then Inheritance by Emily Powers, who also read tonight. So
all right.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.